England winter, 1943. The runway was slick with frost, lit only by yellow lanterns and the dim sunrise bleeding through the mist. One by one, B-17 flying fortresses limped home from the frozen skies over Germany. Their engines sputtered, wings cracked, hulls torn open. Some dragged long smoke trails, others had blood on their glass. Ground crews ran toward each aircraft the moment it touched down. Paramedics pulled out the wounded. Mechanics stared at the damage. Bullet holes in the wings, holes in the fuselage. Some planes looked like they shouldn't have flown at all. One of them, tail shredded, engine 2 dead, had somehow survived the entire 600-mile round trip through fire and steel. The crew climbed down in silence. No cheering, just shaking hands and one man vomiting behind the hangar. Back at the airfield's operations room, engineers pinned new diagrams to the wall. Silhouettes of bombers, marked with clusters of red dots. Each dot was a bullet hole, each hole a story. They were looking at where the planes were hit, and not asking why those ones came back. They had no idea that they were looking in the wrong place. By mid-1943, the skies above Europe had become the most dangerous battlefield of World War II. The United States Army Air Forces had launched a bold and controversial strategy: daylight precision bombing, a tactic built on confidence in American engineering and the belief that accurate bombing could cripple the Nazi war machine without the need for night raids or mass civilian casualties. The B-17 Flying Fortress was the cornerstone of this plan. Nicknamed for its defensive armament, up to 13. 50-caliber machine guns bristling from all angles. The B-17 was designed to fly high, fly far, and deliver punishing payloads over strategic targets deep inside enemy territory. Oil refineries, aircraft factories, rail yards, supply depots. The logic was simple: break the spine of Nazi logistics, and the war could end without an invasion. But the theory collided with reality almost immediately. Unlike the British Royal Air Force, which bombed at night to avoid fighters, the Americans flew in broad daylight. They believed tight formations and heavy guns could hold off the Luftwaffe. But by the summer of 1943, those hopes were bleeding out over occupied Europe. Flak guns opened up as soon as the bombers crossed the French coast, black blossoms of steel in the sky, sometimes so thick the air itself seemed to ripple. And then came the German fighters. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf FW-190s, swarming in packs, diving through bomber formations, tearing through aluminum like paper. American losses skyrocketed. On some missions, over 25% of bombers were shot down. That meant for every 4 planes that took off, one never returned. And for each B-17 that fell, 10 young men vanished in smoke and fire. The psychological toll was immediate. Veteran crews grew harder to find. New ones flew their first missions with terror in their eyes. Many didn't last more than 5 sorties. Some prayed before takeoff. Some drank. Some simply stared at the sky. At the air bases in England, in places like RAF Bassingbourn and RAF Thorpe Abbotts, every morning began with rows of planes, full tanks, full bomb loads, and full hearts. And every afternoon ended with less. It was clear something had to change, quickly. Commanders debated how to reduce losses. One option stood out: reinforce the planes. Add more armor. After all, when returning B-17s were inspected on the ground, the engineers could clearly see where bullets had struck. They plotted the hits on diagrams. The same areas showed up again and again: wings, fuselage, tail. The logic seemed obvious. Strengthen those zones. If bullets were hitting there, then that's where the planes were vulnerable. But something didn't sit right. No matter how much armor you added, the B-17 still had to fly. Every pound of protection meant a pound less in bombs or fuel. It couldn't be everywhere. It had to be smart. And yet the smartest minds on base, the pilots, mechanics, commanders, all made the same assumption. Study the planes that survived and fix what got hit. They were staring at holes. They just weren't asking the right question. By late 1943, the pressure had reached Washington. Losses were becoming unsustainable. Bomber Command needed answers, not just from pilots, but from people who understood systems, risk, and data. So, they turned to an unlikely ally, a group of civilians working quietly behind the war's front lines. In a building far from the sound of gunfire, in New York City, the Statistical Research Group, SRG, operated in near total secrecy. It was a collection of minds pulled from America's finest institutions, Columbia, Princeton, Stanford, mathematicians, economists, physicists, and statisticians, most of whom had never worn a uniform. Their weapons weren't guns, they were formulas, algorithms, data. The US government had created the SRG to answer one growing question: how could statistics help win a war? One of its most brilliant members was a man named Abraham Wald. Wald was born in 1902 in Cluj, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A mathematical prodigy from a Jewish family, he earned his doctorate in Austria before fleeing the Nazis in 1938. By the time he arrived in the United States, he was known as one of the sharpest mathematical thinkers in the world. Wald didn't fly bombers. He never saw combat. But he understood something others didn't. What data hides is often more important than what it shows. When the Air Force presented him with diagrams of returning B-17s, each one riddled with holes in predictable places, they expected confirmation. Yes, they assumed he would say. These are the areas to reinforce. But Wald didn't say that. He said the opposite. These bullet holes only show you where a plane can be hit and still survive. He explained. They're not a map of weakness. They're a map of survivability. The engineers were stunned. Wald continued. If a plane came back with holes in the fuselage and wings, then clearly those hits weren't fatal. The aircraft still made it home. But the ones that didn't come back? Their damage wasn't recorded because they never landed. So the real vulnerable areas, they were the ones not riddled with bullet holes on the surviving planes. That meant areas like the engine compartments, the cockpit, and the central fuel system, places that appeared untouched on the returning aircraft, were likely the places where any hit meant total destruction. It was a radical reversal in thinking. The Air Force had been planning to add armor to the most damaged zones. Wald showed they needed to add it to the least damaged zones. In the quiet of his New York office, with no smoke or gunfire around him, Wald had unearthed a truth that would save hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives. This principle would later become known as survivorship bias. At its core, it's the mistake of focusing only on the people or things that made it through a process, while ignoring those that didn't, and therefore misjudging what truly matters. But Wald wasn't thinking about philosophy. He was thinking about survival. He and the SRG produced a report that not only flipped the Air Force's thinking, but laid the foundation for a new approach to battlefield decision-making. Cold, data-driven, and brutally effective. And once those changes were implemented, armor placed not on the wings or tail but around engines, fuel tanks, and the cockpit, something remarkable began to happen. The bombers started coming back. Not all of them. War never offers guarantees. But the odds improved. The aircrews noticed. And as the mission counts rose, morale began to shift. Not because of a new weapon, not because of a new tactic, because someone had finally stopped looking at the bullet holes and started looking at what was missing. For the men who flew the B-17s, survival wasn't theoretical. Each mission was a roll of the dice, with lives wagered against steel, fire, and sky. A full bombing tour in the 8th Air Force meant 25 missions, but by mid-1943, few completed it. The odds of surviving all 25 were less than 1 in 4. Inside the aircraft, 10 young men worked in a symphony of noise and fear. The pilot and co-pilot navigated turbulent air and flak storms. The bombardier lay prone in the nose, cradling the Norden bomb site. Waist gunners stood in freezing temperatures, firing at streaking fighters through open ports. The tail gunner, isolated at the back, often saw death first. They flew without pressurization, without warmth. Temperatures at 25,000 feet dropped below -40. Oxygen masks frosted over. Fingers went numb on trigger grips. Every second in the sky was loud, cold, and potentially final. And every hit to the aircraft was felt, a jolt through the frame, a puff of insulation, the scream of wind through ruptured metal. If the hit struck an engine, a fuel line, or the cockpit, there were no second chances. For these men, it didn't matter where the bullet holes were on diagrams. They just knew where the deadliest ones felt. Wald's analysis, done thousands of miles away, eventually translated into extra armor around those very places. The cockpit, the engines, the fuel tanks. The men didn't know his name. But they knew someone had done something right, because a few more came home than the week before. From the German perspective, the American daylight raids presented both opportunity and challenge. The Luftwaffe's fighter command was well-trained, well-equipped, and deeply motivated to stop the bombers before they could cripple German industry. Each B-17 destroyed meant less damage on the ground, fewer civilian casualties, and preserved war output. German pilots, many of them aces from campaigns in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, knew how to tear into bomber formations. They would attack from above, behind, or head-on. Often, they came in waves, one group to draw fire, another to strike the kill zone. They knew where to aim: the engines, the nose, the fuel tanks, the weak spots. And it worked. For a time. B-17 formations were devastating, but not invincible. And when one broke formation, even slightly, it became a floating coffin. But as Wald's recommendations were implemented and new armor schemes took effect, German pilots began noticing something. Their shots were landing, but the bombers weren't falling. Not like before. Their kills dropped. Survivability climbed, the bombers adapted, and the game had changed. To the generals overseeing the bombing campaign, the mission was clear: destroy the Nazi war machine, and do it fast. But what plagued their war rooms wasn't a lack of courage. It was a lack of information. They were being handed data, diagrams, and losses. And like any logical commander, they sought patterns. If planes came back with holes in the wings, then that's where the next batch should be armored. If the tail section was riddled, armor the tail. Simple, linear, wrong. No one questioned the logic. Until Abraham Wald. His insight exposed the flaw in their thinking. They were building strategy on incomplete samples. They were only analyzing the survivors. It wasn't just a math correction, it was a fundamental shift in decision-making. For the first time, leadership was forced to consider the absence of data as data itself. The lack of bullet holes in certain parts of returned bombers didn't mean those areas were safe. It meant those hits were fatal. This change in mindset required humility, to admit that a mathematician might understand war better than a general. And to their credit, the generals listened. That decision may have saved more crews than any battle plan ever drawn on a map. At the core of Abraham Wald's insight was a revolutionary use of logic, to draw conclusions from missing information. Most wartime analysis focused on what could be seen: flak bursts, bullet holes, mission logs. But Wald flipped the equation. He studied what wasn't there. He applied a statistical framework that would later be known as censored data, information that was absent not by chance, but because it had been systematically removed by failure. In this case, the data removed by destruction. Planes that didn't survive simply couldn't be studied. What Wald understood, and what few others did, was that the pattern of damage on returning aircraft was biased. It told only one side of the story of survival. So he reversed the logic. He treated the bullet holes like fingerprints, not of danger, but of durability. The more holes in a zone that still allowed survival, the less it needed armor. And where the holes were missing, in the engines, cockpit, fuel system, he saw absence as evidence of catastrophic vulnerability. It wasn't just a clever twist, it was a breakthrough. Wald had, in effect, created a new way of thinking about risk, not just in war, but in any system where failure erases its own evidence. That method lives on in fields as wide-ranging as aviation safety, finance, medicine, and artificial intelligence. But its first triumph was in the cold, grey skies over Europe. Implementing Wald's idea wasn't simply a matter of belief, it was a challenge of engineering. The B-17 had strict limits. Its massive size masked the reality that it was a delicate balance of lift, weight, and range. Every pound of armor added meant less fuel or fewer bombs. It couldn't be armored like a tank. So, with Wald's recommendations in hand, designers had to be precise. They began reinforcing engine nacelles, especially near fuel lines and hydraulic systems. Additional plating was added beneath the cockpit floor and around the pilot's seat, areas previously left more exposed. Bomb bay doors were left unchanged, as they were rarely fatal zones based on mission data. These changes were subtle but effective. They didn't transform the B-17 into an indestructible machine, but they made it far more likely to absorb a hit and survive. And because the reinforcements were guided by targeted probability, not guesswork, the aircraft retained its range and payload. This wasn't brute force, it was elegant adaptation. A flying fortress, refined by math. Perhaps the most profound impact of Wald's work wasn't structural or mathematical. It was psychological. At first, bomber crews didn't know why things had changed. They didn't know about the SRG. They didn't know a man in New York had reimagined how aircraft were armored. All they knew was that slowly, more of their friends were making it home. Confidence, fragile and essential, began to return. And that shift was powerful. Morale, once dangerously low, stabilized. Crews who had once dreaded each mission began to believe survival was possible. They trusted their machines more. They trusted their chances more. They flew tighter formations. They aimed better. They dropped bombs more accurately. All of it fed back into the mission. Ironically, what made this psychological change possible was not what the men saw, but what they never saw. They never saw Wald. They never saw his chalkboards, or formulas, or diagrams. They never read his reports, or heard his lectures. But they felt his logic, in the missions that came back intact, in the empty seats that no longer appeared after briefings, in the growing hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd live to see the ground again. In war, that's sometimes the only miracle a man can ask for. The request had been simple. The U.S. Army Air Forces wanted to know where to place more armor on their bombers. The engineers believed the answer lay in the returning aircraft, studying bullet holes, patching weak points, and reinforcing them for the next mission. It made intuitive sense. After every raid over Germany, ground crews logged the damage. They outlined where bullets had punctured wings, tails, and fuselage sections. Those diagrams, dotted silhouettes of the B-17, became sacred. They were passed up the chain, used in briefing rooms, filed in reports. More holes meant more danger. Or so it seemed. The plan was already in motion. Shift limited steel plating to the most heavily hit areas. Make those zones tougher, protect them better. Standard military logic, react to what you can measure. And then Abraham Wald told them they were all about to make a deadly mistake. He explained it with brutal clarity. You're not looking at where the planes were fatally hit. You're looking at where they survived hits his argument turned every diagram on its head. What looked like a vulnerability, clusters of bullet holes in the wings or rear fuselage, was in fact evidence of strength. Those areas could take fire and still fly home. They were not weaknesses. They were, in a morbid twist, proof of resilience. The real danger was where the returning aircraft showed no damage at all: the engines, the cockpit, and central systems. If a bomber took a hit there, it didn't come back, which meant those areas never showed up on the charts. Wald didn't just present a theory, he presented math. Using probability theory, he modeled survival likelihoods based on hit locations. He created a corrected dataset, not from the damage recorded, but from the damage missing. In his revised diagrams, the areas with the fewest bullet holes became the highest priority for armor. At first, the Air Force brass resisted. The logic felt backward. It demanded they ignore what they saw and trust in what was invisible. But slowly, resistance gave way. Wald's diagrams were clearer than any anecdote, his reports backed by raw survival numbers. He wasn't just speculating. He was diagnosing a fatal cognitive flaw, survivorship bias. In a war defined by firepower, this was a moment defined by insight. The Air Force scrapped its original armor plans. Instead of reinforcing the wing roots and tail sections, the zones most visibly hit, they focused armor around the engine mounts, pilot compartments, and critical flight systems. Installation began quietly. No dramatic overhauls, just smarter reinforcements, adjustments in weight balance, thin armor plates added to spots once ignored. The changes were invisible to most. But in the sky, they mattered. Crews started noticing it. Some hits that might have been fatal before were now manageable. Fires were less frequent. One engine could be knocked out without the whole plane spiraling down. Cockpit hits were still deadly, but now less likely to be instantly catastrophic. And the data followed. Bomber losses began to drop, not dramatically. This wasn't a silver bullet, but it was noticeable, and in a war of attrition, even a small edge could mean everything. More bombers made it home. More crews completed full tours. More missions were carried out successfully. And all of it traced back to one moment, one turning point, when someone had the courage to say, "We're looking at the wrong data." It wasn't instinct. It wasn't firepower. It was math. And in that moment, buried inside a quiet office far from the front lines, numbers outmaneuvered bullets. In the months that followed Wald's recommendations, the transformation wasn't loud. There were no headlines, no military parades, no official declaration of statistical victory. But within the airfields of the 8th Air Force across England, something began to shift. Slowly, quietly, in a way only the crews could feel. More bombers returned. Some came back with their wings torn, others with the tail nearly gone. But their engines, shielded by new armor, kept turning. Their cockpits, once exposed, now gave pilots just enough protection to stay conscious through flak bursts. Radio operators could still call for help. Navigators could still chart a course home. It was subtle, but undeniable. Loss rates, which had peaked as high as 30% on missions like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, began to fall. Over the next 6 months, as armor placement improved and escort strategies evolved, survival rates steadily rose. Wald's contribution wasn't the only reason, but it was one of the most critical hidden reasons behind the shift. And no one had seen it coming. At mission briefings, pilots were still being told flight paths, target coordinates, enemy positions. But somewhere between the diagrams and the flak predictions, there was an unseen variable now on their side. Someone had looked at what wasn't there, and changed what was. One crew from the 303rd Bomb Group returned from a mission over Bremen with half their stabilizer gone, but the engines held. Another from the 91st limped in on 2 engines, leaking fuel but alive. The reports piled up, and then the stories started circulating. Someone said it was the armor, someone else said it was just luck. But in truth, it was a formula, scrawled in chalk on a blackboard at Columbia University. A set of variables, an equation, a pattern only a man like Abraham Wald could see. Even General Curtis LeMay, the hard-driving, no-nonsense commander who would later lead firebombing campaigns across Japan, was said to have reviewed the survivability data and signed off on the changes. He didn't care where the insight came from. If it saved crews, he was in. Meanwhile, Wald remained out of the spotlight. He continued his work at the SRG, tackling other statistical riddles of war: artillery dispersion, optimal convoy spacing, failure rates of mechanical systems. He became, unofficially, the man who made war more survivable, not through weapons, but through thinking differently. And as the US bombing campaign accelerated in 1944 and 1945, the impact of his contribution compounded. Each surviving bomber meant more data, more experience, more raids. Each crew that lived carried knowledge into the next mission: tactics, maneuvers, survival instincts. It was exponential, and it hinged on a single reversal in perspective. Don't ask where the bullets hit. Ask where the bullets killed, but perhaps the most extraordinary part of this story is that Wald didn't consider himself extraordinary. He saw only logic, cold, hard patterns. He believed in what could be tested, proven, repeated. To him, the fact that hundreds of men were alive because of a statistical insight wasn't a matter of pride. It was simply correct thinking. And yet, that thinking had done something that no bomb ever could. It had outwitted death. By the end of 1944, the Allied bombing campaign had evolved into a devastating force. Precision gave way to saturation. Targets expanded from factories and oil fields to entire industrial cities. The introduction of long-range fighter escorts, particularly the P-51 Mustang, added another layer of survivability for the bomber formations. But behind the roar of engines and the thunder of bombs, the quiet contribution of Abraham Wald continued to ripple outward. Within the 8th Air Force, mission planners and aircraft designers had begun adopting data-first thinking, not just for armor, but for everything. Formation shapes, flak altitude bands, radio jamming frequencies. The war was still brutal, still costly, but it was no longer driven solely by intuition or brute experience. Wald's survivorship bias analysis had done more than change aircraft protection. It had cracked open a blind spot in military logic. Commanders now asked new questions. What aren't we seeing? What data is missing? What does absence mean? In early 1945, after thousands of missions and over 1 million tons of bombs dropped, B-17 crews were still facing danger. But the odds had shifted. More crews were completing their tours. More veterans were returning to train others. More lessons were being carried forward rather than lost in wreckage. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, few in the ranks knew the name Abraham Wald. Even fewer knew of the Statistical Research Group, a civilian think tank that had worked in shadows while the world burned. The work had been classified, its impact hidden, but its effect was undeniable. At a time when military innovation was often measured in calibers and kilotons, Wald's intervention had required neither steel nor blood, just clarity, just logic. And for every bomber crew who made it back because their engines or cockpit were reinforced, his unseen hand was there, traced across the rivets, curled around the survival odds. In the post-war years, as historians pieced together the civilian side of the war effort, Wald's report became a landmark study in applied statistics. It was reprinted in journals, taught in universities, referenced in fields as diverse as finance, epidemiology, and software engineering. But no footnote or lecture could match the real legacy. Hundreds of airmen lived, because one man had refused to believe that only what you could see was what mattered. After the guns fell silent and the skies cleared, the world began to ask how it had survived. For most, the answers were familiar: tanks, ships, code breakers, atomic bombs. But for those who studied the war more closely, especially the intellectual war waged behind the scenes, a new kind of hero began to emerge: the civilian scientist, the quiet mind behind the curtain. Abraham Wald never wore a uniform. He never flew in a bomber. He never heard the scream of flak or saw a friend vanish in the clouds. But his fingerprint was all over the war's outcome. When the archives of the Statistical Research Group were declassified in the late 1940s, researchers were stunned. The SRG had tackled everything from ballistics and supply chain efficiency to artillery recoil and aircraft maintenance lifespans. They had created algorithms for optimal convoy spacing to avoid U-boat attacks, and even determined how long soldiers could be expected to remain combat effective under stress. But among all those contributions, Wald's analysis of survivorship bias stood apart, not just because it was mathematically elegant, but because it had saved lives in real time under fire. In the decades that followed, Wald's insight became a foundational lesson in critical thinking. His diagrams appeared in textbooks. Business leaders quoted him. Engineers referenced him. Behavioral economists named survivorship bias one of the most dangerous cognitive traps in decision-making. But few appreciated just how close his discovery had come to being ignored. Had leadership refused to listen, had they insisted on armor where the bullet holes were most visible, more bombers would have been lost. More crews would have vanished. The bombing campaign might have stalled. History could have turned. Instead, because one man chose to trust data over assumption, a hidden edge was found and exploited. Wald died young in 1950 in a plane crash in India. He never became a household name. No statue was raised, no medal pinned to his chest. But for those who understand war not only as a contest of arms, but a contest of perception, Wald stands as a giant. His report is still taught today, not as a relic of the past, but as a living principle. Don't trust what you can see. Ask what you're not seeing. Ask what's missing. And never assume that survival tells the whole story. Because sometimes the silence speaks louder than the noise. In war, there are moments when steel wins, when firepower overwhelms, when brute force bends history. But there are also moments when quiet clarity cuts deeper than a bullet. Abraham Wald never stood on a battlefield. He never touched a bomber's wing. He never looked a gunner in the eye before takeoff. But his mind changed the course of survival for hundreds of them, because he asked a better question. In a world drowning in visible data, bullet holes, damaged wings, shattered glass, Wald turned his gaze toward the silence, toward the areas untouched, toward the planes that didn't come back. He saw what no one else dared to, that the evidence of life is only half the truth, that absence carries weight, that what we don't see is often the very thing killing us, and in doing so, he rewrote how we understand damage, how we measure threat, how we prepare for risk, not just in war but in life, business, science, and thought. His insight didn't drop like a bomb, it unfolded like a whisper. But that whisper echoed through hangars, briefing rooms, and gunner seats, all the way to the end of the war and beyond. Because sometimes the most powerful victories aren't won with weapons, they're won with wisdom.